joining us today for the first event in our summer HR compliance webinar series. In interest of time, we're going to jump right in. I'm Sophie Dietrich, the HR professional for the Compliance Center at Wagner, Falconer, and Judd, and I am here to get us started. Before we jump in, I'll share two housekeeping items. First, we don't expect to have time for questions today, but if there is an item you'd like further clarity on, just send us a ticket in our Compliance Center portal and we'll connect you with our team that way. Second, so you are aware, the webinar is being recorded to share with those who cannot attend live. So with those items covered, let me introduce you to our presenter, George Hiller. George is one of our employment law attorneys on the Compliance Center team here at WFJ. He dedicates much of his practice to counseling business leaders on maintaining compliance with all of those federal, state, and local laws like we're doing today. So we are excited to have him share with us. And thank you again, everyone, for joining. And with that, I'll hand things over to George.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, welcome everybody. Today we're going to be covering keeping up with compliance, what everyone should know. It is going to be a dense presentation, to say the least. A lot of the federal changes that we're going to be talking about today are not simple, and they are going to potentially have some major impacts across businesses throughout the country. But I think the best place to get started here, is with today's agenda. So we're going to be talking about the Department of Labor's independent contractor test, the DOL's increased salary threshold for exempt employees, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. We're going to do an OSHA update. We're going to talk about those EEO-1 reporting requirements and due dates. Then we're going to discuss the federal non-compete ban, even though it's technically, in the court system right now. We'll go through that and what it could mean for you here in the future. And then finally, I will do a brief Minnesota law teaser for you. It's not going to be a full-on update because the legislature here in the state of Minnesota decided to make some pretty significant changes, even though they promised us they wouldn't. But before we get there, the Department of Labor's independent contractor test. The Trump administration created a rule that went into effect March 2021, which is probably the independent contractor test that you've been using for quite a while. The rule was then delayed and rescinded by the Biden administration. A new proposed rule was rolled out in October of 2022, received a lot of comments. Then the final rule was published in January 10th of 2024 with an effective date of March 11th, 2024. So this rule, this interpretation is currently in effect. Now, what is it? Let's talk about the 21 independent contractor test first, or the pre-21 independent contractor test first. It includes 5 factors, but it assigned greater weight to 2 core factors: the nature and degree of control over the work and the opportunity for profit and loss. Both of these core factors pointed towards the same classification. Then there was a substantial likelihood that the classification was the proper classification. So again, those 2 core factors are here up at the top: the nature and degree of control that the employee or the independent contractor has over their work, and the worker's opportunity for profit and loss. Those additional guiding factors that are going to become more relevant here shortly are the amount of skill required for the work, the degree of permanence of the working relationship, and whether the work is part of an integrated unit of production. Now, the new 2024 independent contractor test It's analyzed using a totality of the circumstances analysis. So it eliminates that core and weighted factors analysis that was pre-21. No one factor is dispositive, and the weight given to each factor depends on the facts and circumstances of the particular relationships. The factors that are listed, those 6 factors, are not exhaustive, but let's just quickly run through them since we've got them on the screen. The opportunity for profit and loss depending on managerial skills, investment by the worker and potential employer, the degree of permanence of the work relationship, the nature and degree of control by either the employer or the independent contractor over their own work, the extent to which work performed is an integral part of the potential employer's business, and the skill and initiative of the worker. The opportunity for profit or loss must be based on the use of managerial skill, including the initiative or business acumen or judgment of that independent contractor or employee, and that's effect on the worker's economic success or failure. Control, which is the nature and degree of control here, includes whether the potential employer sets the worker's schedule, supervises the performance of the work, or explicitly limits the worker's ability to work for others, including reserving such rights. So what does this mean for businesses as far as risk is concerned? Well, there's increased risk that many workers may be classified as employees when they were previously independent contractors, right? Because instead of looking to just 2 factors, we're now looking to 6. The lack of key factors will increase the vagueness and ultimately litigation, right? Because again, no one factor is dispositive, and weight is not given heavily towards one or the other. It's all fact specific. So I'm sure you're sitting there thinking to yourself, oh, well, does this independent contractor test mean that some of my employees or some of my independent contractors are in fact employees? And the answer is, it depends. The classic lawyer answer, right? But it does, because these factors are equally weighted and they're kind of analyzed based on the facts at issue. And how the DOL is going to use this new rule as part of its audits and enforcement is only going to be revealed to us in time. So they're just, oh my goodness, I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Okay. So these are things that we're just going to have to watch as time goes on. Hopefully litigation provides us with a little more clarity on how these factors are going to be applied in particular jurisdictions, so that we can do a better analysis as the issue comes up. But there are several legal challenges facing this new independent contractor test. Most recently, and the one that we're keeping our eye on the most because it is where it is, was on April 17th, 2024. The plaintiffs moved for summary judgment in district court in the Eastern District of Texas to vacate the Department of Labor's final rule and reinstate the previous pre-2021 rule. What the result of this litigation is, we may not know for some time. It really depends on how quickly the Eastern District of Texas is going to work. So what can you do in the meantime? Because the reality is you can't sit and wait for litigation to follow through to its inevitable conclusion, whatever that may be, you have to deal with the regulations as they are, and as they are, this is a new rule. You need to review your independent contractor relationships, including your procedure for engaging independent contractors as it relates to those factors that we previously mentioned. You might want to consider adopting an independent contractor policy regarding how and when you'll engage those independent contractors to make sure that you don't run afoul of the new rule. This would be a policy that you can roll out to all managers within your organization who are working with independent contractors to make sure that there's consistency. Consider modifying your existing independent contractor agreements with those new DOL factors in mind, right? You can make changes as you bring on new independent contractors or renegotiate prior contracts to make sure that you stay in compliance with the rule. Consider changing certain worker pay structures or shifting some workers to employee status. This is going to be one of those solutions that maybe looks a little different for the employee, but it is certainly an option for you guys to approach maybe making those pay structures and shifts for those employees that are thinking about coming on as employees. We're really going to just have to wait and see. So the final rule came along with a monetary penalty for inflationary adjustments effective January 5th, 2024. And the final regulations address penalty imposed under ERISA, OSHA, FLSA, FMLA, the INA, and other statutes. This is really just important to keep in mind, because if you don't go addressing these issues with your old independent contractor agreements and they're not compliant with the new test, you could be facing monetary penalties. So now we get to talk a little bit about the DOL's other interesting new or upcoming change, which is the increased salary threshold. In September of 2023, the Department of Labor published a rule proposing an increase to the salary threshold from $684 a week to $1,059 a week. As of April 2nd, 2024, the rule is under review, and the White House Office of Management and Budget will release the rule and it become final here shortly. If I recall, and I should have updated this slide, I apologize for that. The rule is set to go into effect July 1st with a secondary date for a further increase here January 1st of 2025. So let's talk about it in a little more detail. It does not change the duties test for current exemptions for executive, administrative, and professional employees. It does raise that threshold, however, to $55,068 annually. A footnote to that proposed rule also indicates that at the time of the final rule would be released, the updated salary threshold might be closer to $60K. And then it also adjusts the highly compensated employee's salary threshold to at least $143,998 annually. The interesting thing here is that this rule comes with an escalation clause or an escalator clause that says it's going to have automatic increases to every salary threshold every 3 years. So what does this mean for you? Well, it's time for you to conduct an audit to make sure that you're in compliance. You need to identify which employees are classified as exempt within your organization, but do not meet the updated thresholds, and consider either increasing their salary or reclassify them as non-exempt and begin tracking their hours and paying them overtime, right? It may not be feasible for you as an organization to increase everybody's salary to $55,000, even though they might be doing otherwise exempt work because of cost constraints. So you would potentially shift those employees to a non-exempt position, begin tracking their hours, and pay them overtime. You're going to want to consider which option is ultimately more expensive or more economical for you. If an employee doesn't work more than 40 hours in a work week, then that's probably an affordable route to take to reclassify them as non-exempt. When you're making these changes, you need to be aware of a couple things that are maybe more intangible in some sense, right? The employee morale is something to consider. It's obviously going to be impacted because change is change. Some people are comfortable with it, some people are not, and how that change impacts people's livelihoods tends to be scrutinized by those employees. How will hours be tracked from an HR standpoint, from a procedural standpoint? What changes are you going to make sure that those employees are getting their hours tracked to the extent that they need to? There are those legal risks to consider. Wage and hour violations are very serious violations. And you want to make sure that you are not running foul of the FLSA where you can, in this circumstance especially. And then you want to have a clear communication plan with your managers. Teams being organized when this kind of stuff comes up is really important so that nobody gets blindsided and nobody's confused. It also provides an opportunity to alleviate any potential questions as to whether a position truly meets the duties test of the exemption rules. So if there's an employee who's currently exempt, but under the test for administrative professional or executive, they don't actually meet that requirement, well, this is an opportunity for you to reclassify them along and kind of bundle it with everybody else without necessarily creating exposure. So the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. We're getting into the meat of our presentation here. We're about halfway through on the slides, but I would say we are about to get to the bulk of our presentation because this and what follows are going to become kind of the more technical changes that we see in federal law here in 2024. So on April 19th, 2024, the EEOC published the final regulations implementing the PWFA. They're going to go into effect on June 18th of this year. So it's very up and coming here, I think, in about a week. And essentially, it's the reasonable accommodation requirement for pregnant workers. The PWFA requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified employees, including applicants, with known limitations related to or affected by or arising out of pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions, unless the accommodation will cause an undue hardship on the business. The PWFA greatly expands what an employer was previously required to accommodate as it relates to pregnancy-related accommodations. Under the PWFA, a known limitation is defined as a physical or mental condition related to, affected by, or arising out of pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions, regardless of whether or not the condition meets the definition of a disability under the ADA. This is regardless of the ADA, guys. This is an employee, an employee can be entitled to a reasonable accommodation for a known limitation relating to pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions, even if the limitation is not otherwise a disability. An employee is qualified if they, with or without reasonable accommodation, can perform the essential functions of the employment position. Importantly, however, unlike accommodations for disabilities under the ADA, the PWFA allows an employee to be qualified even if they cannot perform one or more of the essential functions of the job if the inability to perform the essential functions is temporary. The employee could perform the essential functions in the near future, and the inability to perform the essential functions can be reasonably accommodated. So there's a three-part test there that you have to analyze. It's important to note that the PWFA does not replace federal, state, or local laws that are more protective of employees affected by pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical condition. Minnesota law requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to employees for health considerations related to pregnancy or childbirth, unless the accommodation will cause an undue hardship on the operation of the employer's business. Minnesota's pregnancy accommodation statute applies to employers with one or more employees, while the PWFA applies to employers with 15 or more employees. So it's a lot to kind of digest, but essentially what we're looking at here is increased protections for pregnant workers beyond the ADA, even if they can't perform those essential functions of their position, so long as they're temporary. They can perform those functions in the near future, and the inability to perform the essential functions can be reasonably accommodated. That is separate and apart from those state law requirements like we have in Minnesota. So keep that in mind, that different jurisdictions may have laws in place that already provide protections up to or exceeding the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act as it currently stands. These final regulations go into great detail regarding implementation of the PWFA and provide numerous examples for reference. While while there are some key takeaways from the final regulation, we want to keep in mind that the limitation needs to be known, the employee needs to be qualified. What constitutes an undue hardship is going to be specific to each business, and we want to make sure that we understand when documentation can be requested and when. So what are reasonable accommodations? The regulations identify several specific examples of possible reasonable accommodations, and I'm just going to run through some of them here with you today so that you have an idea of what you might be providing to those pregnant workers here in the near future. Frequent breaks, opportunity to sit or stand as needed, schedule changes, part-time work, paid and unpaid leave, telework or remote work, hybrid working environments, parking, light duty work, making existing facilities accessible or modifying the work environment as needed, job restructuring, temporarily suspending one or more essential functions of that employee's job, acquiring or modifying uniforms, equipment, or other devices in the workplace, adjusting or modifying examinations or policies as necessary. The regulations also identify modifications that in virtually all cases will be found to be reasonable accommodations that do not pose an undue hardship. Carrying or keeping water near and being able to drink as needed, taking additional restroom breaks as needed, allowing an employee whose work requires standing to sit and whose work requires sitting to stand, and taking breaks to eat and drink as needed. These are accommodations that will more likely than not be an undue hardship. I know that was a little bit of a double negative there. And then I think when it comes to analyzing whether an accommodation that is an undue hardship, you have to look to consideration of the length of time the employee will be unable to perform those essential functions, whether there is work for the employee to accomplish, the nature of the essential function and the impact on it, including frequency, whether the employer has provided other employees in similar positions who are unable to perform the essential functions of their positions with temporary suspensions of those functions or duties, which goes back to one of the things that I always advise my clients on, which is consistency is king. You need to be consistent with all your employees in similarly situated circumstances. Whether there are other employees, temporary employees, or third parties who can perform or be temporarily hired to perform the essential functions in question, and whether the essential functions can be postponed or remain unperformed for any length of time, and if so, for how long. An employer is not required to seek supporting documentation from an employee who requests an accommodation under the PWFA. If the employer does, it can only do so if it is reasonable to require documentation under the circumstances in order for the employee to determine whether the employee has a physical or mental condition related to, affected by, or arising out of the pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions and needs a change or adjustment at work. The regulations identify situations where it is not reasonable to request documentation. Where it is not reasonable to request documentation, here they are. When the limitation and need for reasonable accommodation are obvious. when the employee has already provided sufficient information to substantiate that employee has a known limitation, when the employee is pregnant and the reasonable accommodation is one of the 4 accommodations that will be deemed reasonable in virtually all cases that we discussed just recently, and when the limitation for which the accommodation is needed involves lactation or pumping. So as you guys can see, there is a lot to the PWFA, and it's important to keep in mind that when these issues arise, if you have questions, if you have concerns, that's what we're here for. So what can you do to prepare for the PWFA as it's about to come into effect? You should review and potentially revise your pregnancy accommodation policies to make sure you are in compliance with the PWFA, as well as any other state laws that may provide pregnant worker accommodations protections. This is especially true if your existing pregnancy accommodation are based on the rules of the ADA, because again, the PWFA rules are very different. The final regulations are a good resource for understanding the scope of the PWFA. There are numerous examples in there, like I said, so it may be worth your while to go and look at them yourselves. And again, if your policy is drafted based off of the ADA, that's likely not going to be sufficient anymore, and it's going to need an update and change. The OSHA update. On April 1st of 2024, the Department of Labor published its final rule clarifying the rights of employees to authorize a representative to accompany an OSHA compliance officer during an inspection of their workplace. Employees may either select another employee or a non-employee third party to serve as their representative during an inspection. The regulation no longer suggests that non-employee third-party representatives would be limited to individuals with formal credentials, such as safety engineers or industrial hygienists. Under the new rule, compliance and safety officers are allowed to permit a non-employee third party to join the inspection if the third party presence will aid the compliance officer in conducting an effective and thorough physical inspection of the workplace by virtue of their knowledge, skills, or experience. The purpose of the revised rule is to clarify specifically 3 things. The representative authorized by employees to be an employee of the employer or a non-employee third party. Second, the employee's options for the third party representation during OSHA inspections are not limited to persons with formal credentials. And third, a third party representative authorized by employees may be reasonably necessary to conduct an effective and thorough physical inspection of the workplace by virtue of their knowledge, skills, or experience. Minnesota has an OSHA approved state plan where a federal program change is a new permanent standard or more stringent amendment to an existing permanent standard. The state shall pass a state standard adopting the new standard within 6 months of the effective date of the new federal standard, and Minnesota will need to pass a new rule adopting the minimum federal OSHA standard. In anticipation of the effective date of the new rule, which is has already passed. Employers should revisit policies and procedures that instruct on how to receive OSHA inspectors who wish to gain access to a job site, and how management should respond to non-employee third-party designees as the employee representative during an inspection. So some pretty significant changes here with the OSHA standards. We're going to see Minnesota adopt the same standards here shortly. Employers should try to stay in the loop in the employee's process for choosing their walk-around representative. One way to stay in the loop, as example, in this process may be through an active safety committee, in which it can be encouraged that the employee walk-around representative be chosen, or at very least openly discussed within that safety committee. The bottom line: OSHA's new rule should not be interpreted as an invitation to unions to ramp up organizing activities under the guise of participation in OSHA inspections. The presence of third-party representatives during OSHA walkarounds is only for the purpose of aiding in the inspection. Specifically, the compliance officer must determine whether good cause is shown that participation by the third-party representative is reasonably necessary to aid in the effective inspection of the workplace by virtue of their knowledge, skill, or experience as mentioned. And the presence of a third-party representative cannot be disruptive to or interfere with the fair and ordinary inspection. Okay, we talked about OSHA. Now we get to talk about EEO1 reporting. I know this is just the most exciting stuff you could possibly imagine, but this is what the federal law update consists of this year in 2024. Are we lucky? Maybe. I'll leave that for you to decide. But EEO1 reporting. The EEOC announced that the 2023 EEO1 Component 1 data collection will open April 30th, 2024, and the Component 1 inspection booklet has been updated. The deadline for submission is June 4th. So, as a reminder to employers who have at least 100 employees and federal contractors who have at least 50 employees, you're required to complete and submit EEO1 reports, which is a government form that can be found at the link that we have here. We're going to provide these slides to you guys at the end of the presentation. It requests information about employees' job categories, ethnicity, race, and gender, and that you provide them to the EEOC and the Department of Labor. This is not voluntary, and it is a legal obligation for you to report this data. The EEOC collects workforce data from employers with more than 100 employees. Employers meeting the reporting thresholds have a legal obligation to provide the data. The data is collected using the reports and is used for a variety of purposes, including enforcement, self-assessment by employers, and research. Each of the reports collects data about gender, race, and ethnicity, and some by job grouping. This information is shared with other authorized federal agencies in order to avoid duplicate collection of data and to reduce burden on the employers. Although the data is confidential, aggregated data will be available to the public. The EEO booklet has helpful instructions, including Appendix B, which contains definitions of the race and ethnicity categories, and Appendix C, which provides descriptions of the job categories. The EEO1 reporting document or guidance is something that I really encourage you guys to all go and download and read for yourselves. EEO1 component data collection is binary. It only provides options like male and female when reporting demographic data. The employers can voluntarily report demographic data for non-binary employees in the comments section of the reports, and non-binary employees should not be assigned to male or female categories or any other categories within those reports. Employers choosing to voluntarily report employee demographic data for non-binary employees should preface any such data in the comments with the phrase additional non-binary employee data. For example, additional non-binary employee data. One non-binary employee in the job category of administrative support workers. Then you provide their race or ethnicity. 3 non-binary employees in the following job category, their ethnicity, and so on. Oh gosh. Okay. Now, the federal non-compete ban. It's currently ongoing as to whether or not the Federal Trade Commission is actually going to be able to exercise its control in regulating these non-competes. But on April 16th, 2024, the Federal Trade Commission announced that it would hold a special open commission meeting, and on April 23rd, it would vote on whether to issue a proposed final rule that would prevent most employers from enforcing non-competes against workers. This includes non-competes that have been previously signed prior to the rule's effective date. The proposed rule generally prohibits employers from imposing non-competes on their workers. Specifically, it would make it illegal for an employer to enter into or attempt to enter into a non-compete with a worker. The term worker means a natural person who works for an employer, whether paid or unpaid. The term includes without limitation an employee or individual classified as an independent contractor, extern, intern, volunteer, apprentice, sole proprietor who provides a service to a client or customer. Under this rule, an employer that entered into a non-compete clause with a worker before the compliance date must rescind the non-compete clause no later than 180 days after publication of that final rule. Other employment restrictions, like non-disclosure agreements, could be subject to the rule if they are so broad in scope that they function as non-competes. The proposed rule is silent on non-solicitation agreements. This is very similar to the Minnesota non-compete ban. While the Minnesota non-compete ban was not retroactive, it does prohibit employers from entering into new non-competes with employees, but it does not prohibit non-solicitation agreements or confidentiality agreements. battle against non-competes is going on at the state level, like I just mentioned. Currently, there are 4 states: California, Minnesota, North Dakota, and Oklahoma. And there are 6 that have pending legislation that could ban non-competes: Illinois, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, Rhode Island, and Wisconsin. I did not have a chance to look into whether or not those non-compete bans passed in those particular states. If you have questions and you want to talk about it and you're in those states, feel free to reach out and we can discuss those states and their laws as well. So how do you deal with these non-compete bans? Well, you need to reevaluate your usage of non-competes generally to determine whether or not if they're even necessary to effectively protect your business interests, right? This seems to be a trend that is pushing through employment law federally and at the state level. It may be worth not facing the headache of changing rules as they come about in the different jurisdictions that you're operating in and balancing different state schemes, and just getting rid of them altogether. Like I said, things like non-solicitation agreements and confidentiality clauses can still be extremely effective, even in spite of these new changes to the law. The other thing I'll say is these rules, these FTC rules especially, are that they are just rules, which means they are driven by the administration that is currently in power, and they can be subject to change potentially come January after our November elections. That's not to say that you can choose to not comply with them, because you absolutely must if they are in effect, but it just highlights the level of uncertainty and the shifting sands that we face when dealing with agency regulations, and how it may be worth just not having to worry about whether or not that regulation is in place or shifting and what's changing and how it's changing. So that concludes the bulk of the federal update for us here today, but I did promise you at the start of our presentation that I would do a brief Minnesota law teaser. And here we go. The Minnesota legislature at the last minute passed an omnibus bill, and I've got it named here, that's bringing more changes to the employment landscape than we initially anticipated. The legislature had promised us after last year's significant changes and rollouts that it was going to be a quiet summer, a quiet spring. Lo and behold, it is not. We're going to be hosting a seminar on these changes in greater detail sometime in September. That's the date that we've currently got slated. But I'm just going to run through some of the things that changed. And, if you have more questions about them, especially the ones that are going to be coming into effect here very shortly, you can always reach out and we can talk about it. There are more earned sick and safe time changes. They're going into effect January 1st, 2025. These changes include changes to employee remedies for employer violations to earn sick and safe time. It changes the way the rate of pay is calculated for employees from the hourly rate to a base rate of pay. The covered employees, instead of being employees who have worked 80 hours, is now employees who are anticipated to work 80 hours in a year. ESST is going to incorporate bereavement leave into the earned sick and safe time leave. So for those of you that have separate bereavement policies, This may be a little bit of a breather for you. You can delete that bereavement policy and just update your earned sick and safe time policy. And now you've got one policy that incorporates both. The increment of time minimum has changed. If you are using either the 1 hour or the 4 hour increment of time, you are not going to see a change here. The law now does not necessarily require documentation about abuse to be from a third party. It can be a written statement from that employee. And there are some changes to union bargaining as it relates to the earned sick and safe time leave. If you work with unions, we can of course talk about this. The Paid Family Medical Leave Act here in Minnesota is going to be going into effect in January of 2026, but they changed the percentages for contribution and a few other things as well. I anticipate that law to continue to get massaged out here over time because we are still quite a ways away from it going into effect. There are now employee misclassification penalties. These are going to go into effect as of July 1st, 2024. These misclassifications are those exempt, non-exempt classifications that we were talking about earlier. And the big thing here to keep in mind is that there is now individual liability for knowingly violating the statute, and the liability is pretty significant. It can be up to $10,000 for each knowing violation. There were some changes to the personnel file statute here in Minnesota. Pregnancy accommodations and parental leave have seen some changes. The Minnesota Drug and Alcohol Testing Statute, DATWA, which got a significant overhaul with the change in the legalization of adult use cannabis here in Minnesota, is getting yet another change as it relates to on-site testing for employees. So this is going to be something that is certainly going to impact your written policy and how you engage in testing. If you've got questions, like I said, we can certainly discuss it. It's going to be something that we dive much deeper into in September. There's going to become a requirement for salary ranges for job postings. Employee record keeping requirements are changing. There are changes to the MHRA, and Minnesota has passed a Data Privacy Act. There is more, but I think that is sufficient to get you guys started on kind of maybe perking your ears up when you hear those keywords like the Minnesota Drug and Alcohol Testing Statute, like employee misclassification, and of course, our favorite, earned sick and safe time. So with that said, thank you all for taking the time here to listen to me talk at you, cover some very, new and complicated issues here in the regulatory schemes federally. And we will, of course, keep you apprised of changes when it comes to whether or not those rules face injunctions or the effective dates change as the result of court proceedings. If you have any questions, you know where to find us. Thank you.